Indeed, there is a lot to talk about, everybody. What's going on? Wow, that should be my introduction for all streams. There's the energy. How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to the Global Gambit live stream here to discuss the latest on the war in Iran. And what seems to be a finalized deal, a near finalized deal between the Iranians and Omanis over the Strait of Hormuz, whilst the United States is largely sidelined. Now, I had a very interesting conversation on the intricate US perspective with a colleague of my guest today, Jason Campbell, that will be released in due course. So keep a lookout for that. We also had a very interesting conversation with General H.R. McMaster, who was a bit more hawkish than maybe some other guests we've had. So lots on the program, lots on the channel to check out. I encourage you to do that. We're also streaming to the Substack. So if you're new on Substack, then of course subscribe so you know when more conversations like these are live. But my guest today is a returning one in the form of Ross Harrison, Senior Fellow at the Middle East Institute and author of the new book, Decoding Iran's Foreign Policy. So I think he's just the man to let me know how to balance what's going on with Jason's analysis of American foreign policy and therefore Iran's. And are we escalating? Well, there's the first question, actually, Ross. Are we escalating or are we at a plateau? What's going on?
Well, we've been in sort of a Groundhog Day kind of existence for the last couple of months where we escalate, we de-escalate, the war of words, we're going to take out Iran's complete capacity. We're going to eradicate the regime. We're going to erase the civilization. All of this, a bit of hyperbolic language. I think right now where we are, Peter, and I'm not sure if we talked about this before, which is I think that the conflict has escalated two different ways. It's escalated horizontally since the very beginning of the war, but dangerously so just in the last couple of weeks with the last round of escalation. It hasn't just been between the United States and Iran. It's also been between Iran and Ukraine, which could potentially tie together in a conflict that's very important to you, obviously, personally, Ukraine, Russia. It also, it's expanded to Egypt. It's expanded to the Houthis and Saudi Arabia in Yemen, Israel, Palestine, the Hashd-Shabi in Iraq. So the escalation, de-escalation question that you asked, I think is important because we are at a moment where both parties or each of the parties can control whether we escalate or de-escalate, right? I mean, the United States can decide to open up the Strait of Hormuz or unblock the blockade, or can, decide not to escalate further. Iran can do that too. It can decide to escalate, which it did about a week ago, or de-escalate. But that decision now rests in Tehran and in Washington. But at some point in time, with all of these various actors on the sidelines now, but part of the conflict, at some point you can lose control. And these two parties might not have the decisional capacity to de-escalate because events on the ground are going faster than their ability to make decisions. Any one of these conflicts can heat up and draw us into a regional conflict. So right now we are in a pause, but we're kind of on a knife edge, I think, in terms of the next round of escalation might not just occur horizontally. It might still, it went to Jordan as well, Jordan and Egypt in the last 10 days. It can expand further, but also can escalate vertically, meaning Donald Trump starts attacking power plants and desalination facilities and electrical grids and bridges. Well, guess what? The Iranians will do the same in the Gulf Arab states. And then we're in a completely different zone. So hopefully we're in a moment where sanity can still prevail, but at a very, precarious, we're in a precarious moment.
Yeah, I promised myself and viewers that I would be more combative in conversations, not in a sort of like unpleasant sense, but be more,
go for it.
No, but like, we need to challenge a little bit more, I think, on the show. And simply what I mean by that is that you were the first person who gave me the concept alongside your counterpart, Alan, about horizontal and vertical escalation, and the threshold capacity is another concept I think you mentioned with me back in March. But Ross, let's be honest. How far can we go with escalation? It makes me think of Professor Robert. Is it Palpay? I'm not sure how to pronounce his
Oh,
surname.
Pape, yeah, Pape, the escalation trap, yeah.
We talked about the escalation trap, the escalation ladder, and I think it's all very important to have concepts. But are we not slightly overkilling this usage of the term escalation at this point? Like, okay, we go back, we go forward. Every day it's like, well, we're going to escalate. The Russians are escalating. They've struck more of Ukraine. Surely, once you've struck all of Ukraine with indiscriminate bombing, that's largely, you can't really escalate further than that. Or am I just being provocative for no?
No. I think no. First of all, I like your line of thinking and your line of query here. Listen, I think the notion, and I think that's what you're asking, the notion of escalation trap, escalation ladder. These are concepts, simplified heuristic devices that we use to try to not overly simplify, but simplify. And I think your question is, are we oversimplifying? I think to some degree it's useful. I think the cautionary tale that I'm trying to say is at some point it doesn't matter. At some point, and this is what happens in war, in total war, is you don't talk about escalation traps necessarily or escalation ladders because you're just in full blown war. And I think at the moment, what the escalation ladder, escalation trap basically implies is that the parties can make decisions. They actually can choose to escalate or de escalate. That's the implicit concept. That's why I think it's important that you ask the question to challenge it. At some point in time, it won't. These concepts may not matter until we get to a point where the parties again have agency and have a choice to decide to de-escalate. Because it's during the fog of war, you don't have the kind of visibility that you need to make these calculations. Escalation. What does escalation trap means? It means that Donald Trump can decide to ramp up the violence and escalate, what we call escalate, and inflict damage, but to no strategic effect. And then if he backs down, then he is perceived as weak. Well, that involves decisions. That implies that he can actually make a decision. But at some point in time, that evaporates. That's why I think it's important to say what I said at the outset of the show, which is that you're maybe approaching a moment where those events will outstrip those concepts. So I think it's an important thing to challenge. I'm glad you did.
Yeah, no, I mean, just on this train of thought, I mean, okay, so we escalate. Trump decides to vertically escalate, and that means heightened military operations. But short of ground troops, how much more does that mean? A return to March and the intensification of aerial combat? That's not going to lead to regime change. No aerial combat has ever done so. And there are some people saying, well, aerial combat these days is very different to what it was in the past 80 years. Well, yes, but still, we don't know what drone capability. I don't think drones are going to overthrow a government yet or something like that. So what, we upscale the naval component? Like, aside from land-based operations, which obviously would be a huge commitment, and obviously that's completely changes and everything, what else can the Americans do?
Well, I think the question becomes, Peter, what is the goal here? So in the beginning of the war, it was not to change the behavior of the Islamic Republic of Iran. It was to decapitate the regime, right? So the question is, have we adapted our military, I wouldn't even call it strategy at this point, but our military approach to Iran to a new type of goal? I mean, it appears that Donald Trump keeps talking about, well, one more turn of the screwdriver and the regime will capitulate. Well, what he's saying is that the regime may not collapse, but it will eventually capitulate to US demands. So I think it really depends on what we're trying to achieve here. I think I said this probably on your program before, but Clausewitz said that, war is the pursuit of politics by other means. And so the question becomes, what kind of political outcome are we looking for? If we're looking for regime change, that's not going to happen unless you put boots on the ground. And even then, that might not happen. If you're looking to basically get the Iranians to choke the Iranians off, if that's your theory of change, as we call it, well, then I guess you could put troops on Karg Island or land them on the littoral areas around, which is a very rocky, very difficult area to land in, but around the Strait of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf, to try to take physical control of the strait. That's a 300-mile area, not the strait, but the Persian Gulf. So you'd have to basically command that whole theater. So it really depends. And I'm not a military analyst. You mentioned that you had H.R. McMaster. Is that right? Not Petraeus, but or McMaster. Yeah, I mean he's a military guy. He probably could tell you. But my understanding is that that you would. But if your goal is to get the Iranians to actually come to the table with different terms than they've come before, then it becomes trickier because that implies that the Iranians have a threshold, a pain threshold that's greater than the United States, and that more pain or more cost that they will incur will get them to change their behavior or their position. And that has been tested over 40 years. Now it's never been tested in the crucible of fire like it is now. But I think it's very clear that the regime doesn't have a plan B. So if they would capitulate, they lose everything. So I don't see you asked the question, well, where do we go now militarily? Well, depends on what your goal is. If it's behavior change, regime change would require something more than the U.S. can actually marshal at this point, has the political will and has the resources in theater to do. Now, if it's behavioral change,
Well, we've been trying to do that for years with sanctions, and it's never worked.
Never work. Right.
The whole emphasis of sanctions is that they are about behavioral change, that they induce a behavioral change. A lot of people who argue that sanctions do have some kind of effectiveness is if they is against apartheid South Africa, right? But that was over the best part of a decade, and it did lead to the eventual behavioral change of the apartheid system, but that wasn't only based on sanctions. So to use military coercion as a form of to induce behavioral change seems really unrealistic unless you're committed to some kind of operation for years. And the Iranians are perfectly suited to deal with all this, no?
Remember, and also I think what's happening is you're having a certain amount of improvisation because the war itself has created the circumstances you're in now, right? The circumstances before the war we weren't talking about the Strait of Hormuz, we were talking about the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb only because of the Houthis' threats to close it periodically in the previous couple of years. But so now we're dealing with a different war, and the question is this administration adaptable enough to adjust to the new circumstances? And it's not clear to me they are.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's simply that Trump is so far in, he can't back out with having to admit a serious faux pas on his administration's side, and it makes me think a little bit about Putin. I posted a video, it probably went live in the past half hour or something, about the growing dichotomy that Putin faces, in that he can either not call mobilization, which leads to a manpower shortage on the front lines, or he does call a mobilization, but that leads to an admittance that the SMO, i.e. war, is not going well. So either way, he's in a sticky wicket. So I guess what I would ask you simply is you mentioned Clausewitz's phrase. Well, there's another concept of his, center of gravity, which I think is very applicable here. How do you think the center of gravity for the United States or Iran is really changing, given the longer this all goes on?
Well, it's a great question, Peter, because one of the things that I do in my book is I talk about how, in reality, what Iran has done over the previous 40 years. And by the way, the Iranians do see this war as a continuation of a war that started over 40 years ago, the Iran-Iraq War. They see this as a third war, a continuation of a much more naked continuation now, but a continuation of a desire and an attention of the United States to basically overthrow the Islamic Republic. But I think what they did over the last 40 years is they followed the principles of Sun Tzu, not so much Clausewitz, which is that you don't create a center of gravity. Center of gravity creates strength, but it also creates vulnerability. And what the Iranians knew is they could not compete militarily with the United States or with Israel. And so what they did is, rather than concentrate power and create what we call a center of gravity, they basically diffused power. They diffused power through the failed states in the region, first in Lebanon in '82 with Hezbollah, then later on during the civil wars in Syria, and then in Iraq when the U.S. goes into Iraq. It insinuated I called it a strategy of hiding in plain sight. I mean, you were talking to General McMaster, he probably could tell you that when, or maybe that was more Petraeus, but when they were in Iraq, the Iranians were there. The U.S. had hundreds of thousands of troops in Iraq. The Iranians were there. They were planting IEDs. They were working in Karbala and Najaf with the Marja, with the religious leadership, political leadership, and they were kind of working to extend their influence and power by diffusing it. Whereas the United States came in concentrating power, creating these center of gravities. And if you think, Peter, about what Iran did in the early days of the war, they took that same strategy of, I mean, if you think about that strategy, it was to make the battlefield so complex for Israel and the United States that it would act as a deterrent. So the theory, they call it the Ring of Fire, right? That if Iran were attacked, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Hashd-e-Shaabi, the Houthis, PIJ, they would all basically could at least activate and encircle Israel, and that would act as a deterrent. And that failed, obviously, in the years after October 7th, when Hamas attacks Israel, and Israel now goes on its own rampage through the region, its own forward defense strategy. Well, think about what Iran did since the early days of this war. They basically used the same strategy of making the battlefield so complex as to deny the opponent their objective. What did they do? They immediately attacked almost every Gulf Arab state, including Oman. I was in Doha when they were attacking Qatar, the Ras Laffan facility. And so what they've done is take that same strategy of sort of diffusion, pushing out conflict to the broader region to make the battlefield so complex that attacking Iran's center of gravity, if there even is one, because remember, they have adapted their institutional structure so that they really don't have a center of gravity. You know, it's interesting, if you look at what they did in Syria, how they learned once the Syrian civil war occurred and the Iranians came in along with Hezbollah from Lebanon, came in to support the Assad regime, the Israelis started picking off the IRGC commanders and started attacking these units. Well, what did the Iranians do? They started basically embedding themselves in the Syrian units so that the Israelis couldn't distinguish between Syrian military units and the Iranians. Again, a strategy of diffusion. So in a way, what Iran did was follow some of the principles of Sun Tzu, which is be shapeless like water, rather than taking a shape, which is what you need for center of gravity. The reason I like your question, Peter, is the question is going forward, will that be enough for them? They're certainly going to, and I'm just writing about this now, they're certainly going to not hide behind their regional proxies any longer. They're going to be much more overt, aggressive, sort of a coercive style of deterrence. But the kind of deterrence they have is really by projecting power beyond the region or beyond Iran into these other states. And whether that creates a new center of gravity that they have to worry about, I don't know.
But and I mean, I appreciate it. It's a good question, obviously, because I asked it, but it coming from myself. But
of course.
No, I'm kidding. But I also want to give you a thank you for you to shout out the guests we've had on. Yeah, McMaster's is on Monday and Petraeus is at the end of the month. So yeah, shameless shout outs there, everyone. But no, I mean, look, I guess I'm quite curious then, what do you make of this potential MOU? I think it's another MOU or between Iran and Oman.
I haven't seen it yet, but my understanding, what I make of it is strategically, it's interesting because we don't know to what degree, or I don't know to what degree the Omanis are communicating with Washington. But I think there's couple ways to look at this. One is that this is Iran basically saying to the United States, "You're not a party to this agreement. You can decide to block the strait or unblock the strait or blockade the strait, but we have agency here, and we're going to work with our regional partner, Oman." The poor Omanis, the last thing they wanted to do is become part of this conflict. But so that's one way of sort of saying we have agency here, even though it's right now the Strait of Hormuz is blockaded. We basically have worked out an arrangement, and it's a different arrangement than existed before before February 28th of this year. The other way of looking at it, and I honestly don't know which one is correct, is that this is actually an indirect form of negotiation between the United States and Iran, because the Omanis are communicating with Washington, and that this could be sort of a way for Washington to save face, to bow to the new reality, which is that the Iranians are not going to give up some different relationship with the Strait of Hormuz, but the U.S. doesn't have to acknowledge it because it's coming from the Omanis. And I don't know which is true. Honestly, I don't know which is true at this point in time. But it's an interesting development because it potentially does potentially answer one of the questions that was answered, one that was left unanswered in the original MOU, which is, what does it mean for Iran to do its best to open up the strait? Because that was the Iranians interpreted that as they control the traffic and they would decide how to open it. And meanwhile, then the United States said, no, it's in the Iranians' hands in their channel, but we're going to move ships over to the southern channel through Oman, because the center channel, which is where most of the ships used to travel, is closed due to mining. So the Americans had this sort of conflict on which side of the strait traffic was going to go. And that's what started this escalation. Well, this kind of potentially resolves that. And I am very hesitant to use the word resolve, because usually things that gets resolved gets dissolved the next day. So, but that's what I make of it.
Okay. I guess, that makes me think a little bit more about, well, I'll say, just as a caveat, that I have a lot of sympathy for the Omanis. I went there a couple of times, and it's a beautiful country. They're very reasonable people, and it's a bit of an oasis in what is the chaos of the Middle East, through no fault of its own, arguably speaking. But to be sort of stuck in the middle and be on the receiving end of the Iranians' coercion, I think is pretty tough. And because they've always been a bridge between the Americans and the Iranians in previous years of diplomatic or whatever, shuttle diplomacy and so on. But what does it mean then for Trump if he is effectively sidelined from this understanding, this deal, whatever it is? Would that trigger Trump to want to do something else and sort of blow the whole thing out of the water?
Wait, did I hear you correctly? You're asking me to predict Donald Trump's thinking or his logic, or I need some bourbon or something before I do start going on that channel. I always say I wrote a book called Decoding Iran's Foreign Policy, not a book called Decoding Donald Trump. Let me say something. I don't have an answer for you on that. What does it mean? As I said, there's two theories. One is it basically shuts him out and boxes him in. And if it's an agreement between the Omanis and the Iranians, it's harder for them to oppose it, though they probably will, the United States. The other part is that if there's some kind of tacit agreement or understanding between the Omanis and Washington. The Washington has communicated some red lines, and so whatever the Omanis finally negotiate with the Iranians will have had the tacit approval of Washington. I don't know which of those is true, but let me say something I think that's also important. It relates to Donald Trump. This is really a test case for how Iran might behave with the GCC states after this war, because this is a bit of Iranian coercion. I mean, the Omanis did not want to be in this position. So I think they're happy to be a party to it, but they didn't want to be in this position of having to negotiate with Iran around the United States. The United States, a month or so ago, threatened to bomb Oman. I agree with you. It's a beautiful place. I've spent much time there over the last number of years. But think about this. If this is the way they're managing issues with Oman, what does it mean in terms of Qatar? Is this going to go to a post-war situation where there is a sort of a resumption of the rapprochement that existed between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and the UAE and Iran, and Qatar and Iran? Or does it mean a completely different set of relationships? And I think what we might be seeing with Oman is that this presages a possible change in relationship, which is that the Iranians are going to try to use the leverage that they have to get the Saudis, the Emiratis, to buy security from them in a way. And they're going to be more aggressive. They're going to be more, I don't. I think this tells you that's not going to go back to the status quo ante in any way as before, and they're going to try to pull the Gulf Arab states further away. I mean, the Gulf Arab states are their instinct now is to hedge a bit, but I think they're going to give the message that the only way for you to be secure is not your U.S. bases. And by the way, they're not going to give up the bases, and the bases aren't going to leave. I don't believe. But I think what they're going to say is that's part of your security, but the ultimate security is going to be bought through us. And that's a change. And I think this MOU or whatever is in the wings or in the wind here with between Iran and Oman could be setting a pattern that we will see in a bigger scale in the coming months.
Yeah, it's one of those things, really. I think that a lot of anti-American Western rhetoric, we have some contrarian voices on the show, contrarian to the mainstream, perhaps, narrative.
Where do you put me? Where am I?
I think you're pretty firmly in the non-contrarian. I mean, not that you challenge the government, but I mean in a sense of you're not cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs.
I hope not.
But no, all I'm simply trying to say is that there's this conception that sort of, America has 800 plus bases around the world, and they're there through the force of imposition of America's sort of imperialist ambitions, which is complete rubbish. A lot of those bases are either inherited from the British Empire or others, or they're inherited or there because the nation states who host them actively want the Americans to be there. Rightly or wrongly, I'm not saying I'm not taking a position on the matter. It's just simply, it's not as simple as the Americans are forcibly there because they can just force it. They're there because the Iraqis, the Qataris, whoever, have asked them to be. Certainly the Kuwaitis after the Gulf War are quite welcoming of the American presence. So anyway, that aside, what do you think that this does do for the US Gulf states relations going broader? I asked this question equivalent to Jason earlier. Do you think it is a fundamental issue for
I'm curious how my answer compares to, as I know Jason quite well, Remy. Listen, I think that the Gulf Arab states are they were already hedging. Saudi Arabia did not join the anti-Russia coalition with the United States in 2022. So the Gulf Arab states, have been diversifying their partnerships, but they really don't have a real alternative in terms of ultimate security yet anyway. But they've been hedging. What does this war mean for them? I think they're going to be quite concerned, not just because of the physical presence of American troops in the Al Udeid base or the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain, or I think if the United States would start to withdraw or pull back, and there's been discussion about them pulling back to Saudi Arabia or Israel or even Western Europe, I think that would probably, from American interest standpoint, would not be a good thing, because the optics there are, U.S. is a paper tiger. You challenge the United States. The United States attacked us. We're now challenging them, and now they pull back. It's like in Lebanon in after the bombing. I think it was 83 or 84. It killed several hundred American troops. The United States basically pulled out, and that left the U.S. quite exposed and sent a message to the Islamic Republic. By the way, the United States is a paper tiger. If the U.S. does that, I think the optics will be poor, and I don't think that the Gulf Arab states necessarily want that, but I do think that they are going to be refiguring their security mixture. I think, as I said earlier, they're going to have to create. They cannot create a bulwark against Iran any longer. I don't think they're thinking that way. I think they're thinking, and each state, by the way, has its own different calculus. But I think they're thinking that the bulwark, offshore balancing kind of thing against Iran is actually going to increase their vulnerability, not by security. So I think they're going to have to figure out a new relationship with Iran, but also hedge against that too. I don't think they're going to completely what we call bandwagon with Iran, but I think they will balance a relationship with Iran with a fortified relationship with the United States, and that's going to be a balance for them. It's going to be a balance for the Iranians. What is considered, how are they going to interpret that kind of? So Yeah, this is, and by the way, Peter, I think it also depends on when this war ends. If there's a lot more damage done, if we do have this vertical escalation, the landscape will change, the political landscape will change completely in some ways. So the comments I'm giving you are based upon assuming that things don't escalate from here, what it would look
Yeah.
like.
Yeah, and just on again another sort of question I had for Jason is the Chinese. The Chinese have been much more involved in this than I think a lot of people would initially understand. The Pakistanis are not suddenly the hubs of diplomatic discourse and expertise. No offense to the Pakistanis, but they just don't have that experience. From my years of working in different fields, the Pakistanis are not the people that you turn to immediately for mediation. And that's because the Chinese have been working quite closely with them from behind the scenes. I think that's quite evident. The point I'm going with is that, okay, America has the hard power influence and securitization factor, guarantor factor for the Gulf states, but China's been, etching away at that. How much do you think the Chinese could offer an alternative to the Gulf states or something, or is it over?
Well, long. I mean, to my knowledge, they basically have one base there. I think it's Djibouti. And I'm checking and check my facts there. I'm not 100%
They have
sure.
one in Djibouti. They have, I think in total they have about 4 military bases now, but 2 of them are outposts, and they're certainly not on the level that Diego Garcia or other American bases are.
Yeah. I mean, my general sense, and I don't watch China, I'm not a China watcher, but my general sense, and I know several people who could come on your program to discuss the China or the Russia piece, but
Right.
my general sense is that China is not ready to step up in terms of real security, that they're there to, as you say, behind the scenes, to work with the Pakistanis, but also I think they're going to have some kind of voice um, uh, at the end of this war as to what the Strait of Hormuz arrangement actually looks like. I mean, I think one of the questions, and I'm skirting a little bit the China question because it's a little bit out of my wheelhouse, but I'm honestly not skirting it in the sense that, listen, we have the Strait of Hormuz issue. We might get to a memorandum of understanding and some kind of de-escalation, but then the question is going to be, after the war, what does the regime look like in terms of managing through the Strait of Hormuz to actually get the center area of the strait open and demined? What's the arrangement going to look like? And I think that's going to require the United States to do something that it is completely allergic to doing, and that is some kind of a multilateral approach, including China, by the way, including India, including Europeans. And that's a big swallow for the United States, because I don't think I think the way that you will move the Iranians to not give up their leverage in the strait, but to adjust their priorities, and will be some kind of an international multinational kind of conference or something on the strait.
Well,
The U.S.
if I can flip it around, then let's come at this from the Iranian towards China instead of China into the Middle East, Iran. We had this unique event last week of the Ukrainians striking an Iranian tanker, and China has been providing non-lethal aid to both the Iranians and the Russians. But this seems to be shifting a little bit, and the Chinese are now providing overhead launches towards the Iranians. Just evidence of this. My point being is that how much do the Iranians look at China for sustained support? Do you think, what is their relationship to the Chinese, and in the longer term balance of power with America like that?
It's a great question, and I think that's something that's going to be shaped by how this war ends. In not to shamelessly refer to my book, but in the book, the last few pages, I caution saying that if Iran was the last number of years was feeling very heady with respect to Russia, because it was helping supply drones and so forth on the Ukraine war. And when I met with the Iranian first President Raisi, I guess it must have been 2022, and then also 2023, and then he was killed. I asked him the question about how do you maintain your leverage against Russia, given the history, and with China too, by the way, given the history of Russian perfidy relative to Iran. And he basically said that our negotiating position is improved because of the Ukraine war. And I counsel in the book that the Iranians face the possibility of overestimating, and this was even before the June war of last year, overestimating to what degree China and Russia would come to their assistance. And I think that after the June war, the way in which China has come to the table or not come to the table is no surprise to the Iranians. They may have been surprised last year to the degree to which they were kind of left out. They were isolated after the June war. I think they're pretty realistic, and I think their gambit before the war was to make themselves more economically valuable to the Chinese. And I think they were struggling with if the Iranians believe if they push their disruptor role in the region, they could actually alienate China, because China wants, unlike Russia, basically China wants stability in the region. This war gives them a little bit of cover to be disruptive and still keep Chinese support. Why? Because they were not the aggressor. They're being disruptive now, but they're doing it under attack. So in some ways, this war could give them a new lease on life, in the sense they were balancing these, making sure that they didn't disrupt the region to the degree that they would disenfranchise themselves from China. This war gives them some cover. So where it plays from this point on, I honestly don't know. I think they're going to try to extract as many concessions as they can from the Gulf Arab states and get as much economic booty as they can from them, and then obviously have China as a trading partner. They're not going to rely on China for reconstruction, or I don't think they have that expectation, or for security.
So in the past sort of few minutes, or in the time that we've been talking, the coordinates, according to the Iranian side, have been agreed with Oman. Like, just to be quite specific about this, is it going to be sort of that we have a very narrow pathway of passage? I forget the word, sail of passage, whatever the phrase is, around the Omanian coastline, and then a very narrow passageway on the Iranian side, and they're going to share the cost, the income from the toll. Is this what this looks like? Are the Gulf states going to have any say on this? Are they going to take a proportion of the income? Like,
yeah, it's not clear. First of all, I think the original idea was that because remember the ideal thing is that the ships sail right down the middle. This is not a big waterway. They sail down the middle. They can't do that now. So I think the one question is this being an MOU to get us to a de-escalation, or is this going to be firmed up in terms of some kind of long-term routing? I don't think they're going to keep. Hopefully, the center of the strait will not be mined forever, and that becomes an option. So I think this is a way to perhaps get the MOU that collapsed, the ambiguity of the MOU. This was a very shoddily put together MOU, and the ambiguity that was in it, the MOU, in a way brought us to this point. So the way I would look at this, and I haven't read, so remember, I haven't seen exactly what's come out, if they've agreed to the language yet. But I think it's language that's designed to reduce the ambiguity of how the strait will be managed in the coming days in order to get to the next phase of negotiation. Now, whether that gets solidified into some kind of precedent that then gets hardened into an arrangement after that, I don't know. Again, that will be up to, that's frankly where I think some kind of international the international community being brought to bear, it will be important. And that's something that is not likely because this administration in Washington is allergic to that, and also because we've basically dissed all of our allies. So, but I think that the long-term state of affairs with the strait, we will end up in a better spot if we have some kind of a multinational coalition, including the Chinese, or not coalition is the wrong term for it, but some kind of a conference that would bring those interests to bear. But anyway, I mean, I think we're going to have to all evaluate the MOU and what comes out of this, because I'm afraid I haven't read the language.
We're all at a loss. Consortium maybe is a good word.
Yeah, it's possible.
But yeah, I mean, looking ahead, then simply, the US is still rather ostracized from this deal. But the other thing that is rather unusual, the last time we spoke a couple of weeks back or whatever, was that the Houthis were being activated, quote unquote, and Bab el-Mandeb was going to become the second front, and it's all chaos. Rather underwhelming, if I'm honest. Where are the Houthis? What's going on? Okay, they have strike Saudi Arabia, but sort of this imminent closure, and then the global economy will be absolutely screwed. Like, are the Houthis
we tend to,
are they not acting?
Yeah, I mean, we tend to see these actors, Piotr, as sort of radicalized forces. And I think what we've learned through this conflict and over the last couple of years is they're basically a proxy to some degree of Iran, but they have their own interests inside Yemen. And I think what you've seen, their approach has been very interesting, both in terms of them having stayed out of the conflict until the last month or so. That could be at Iran's direction, or it could be a frustration for Iran. That could be the Houthis' calculus. We don't know. But I think the fact that the action they took of closing the strait to Saudi ships was an attempt to be under the threshold of what it would take for the United States to open up a different front against them and use military activity against them. So I think there's a certain calibration going on all fronts. The Iranians, I think, have been careful about how they've escalated. They've escalated horizontally to send messages, but they've been careful. The Americans, in some way, I think, have been careful in terms of the degree to which they've escalated. And I think we see the Houthis the same thing. And maybe this is a good place to end, because that's where we are now, where it seems like each of the parties is calculating and trying not to close off avenues of negotiation and avenues for de-escalation. But I think everybody's aware that at this point in time, if in fact this does not lead to some kind of de-escalation, the next round, we could see the parties, the U.S. and Iran losing control, and then you have a regional war. So I think we're seeing some cautionary signs there, even though from the Washington's perspective, they all look crazy from the White House perspective, but they seem to be very calculating.
Crazy's calling those insane is interesting.
There you go. You said it, I didn't, but that's
well, one needs to take a look in the mirror, but unfortunately, one also believes that that's all that the chief commander-in-chief likes to do is look at himself in the mirror.
May I say one more thing just as we close?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so I was on BBC. It was yesterday or today. It was BBC English, then BBC Persian, and I'm not sure how this translated Persian, but somebody asked me the question about, where do we go from here? And I remember an old Scottish tale or joke that I heard in a bar somewhere, I think in Edinburgh, and the joke was that there's a traveler comes in and asks the bartender, "Well, how do we get to Aberdeen?" And the bartender shook his head and said, "Well, if I were going to Aberdeen, I wouldn't do it from here." And that's sort of my parting message here. If we were trying to resolve this conflict, I probably would not be doing it from this point. I would back up several months and create a different path, but that's not where we are. So,
well, just to build on that joke, at least he didn't say Glasgow, because I wouldn't go there at all. But anyway,
okay.
No Scottish viewers. I've never been to Scotland or Glasgow, so I'm joking. But anyway, everyone watching, this has been Ross Harrison, Senior Fellow at the Middle East Institute, and author of the new book that you can see behind him, Decoding Iran's Foreign Policy. And I think he's done a decent exercise in demonstrating his knowledge of Iran's foreign policy. And yeah, if you enjoyed the conversation, then of course do drop the video a like, and please subscribe if you haven't already, both here and on Substack. We're doing much more.
Thanks for your challenges. It's been great.
Of course. And yeah, everyone will be back tomorrow, same time, same place. Speak soon.
Thank you.